When it was found that blacks were being unequally compensated for their Civil War service, they let the issue be known, and we'll cover in this video how this issue was finally corrected. But alongside this issue was another problem, and that was allowing black officers to command black troops in the Union Army. This seems like it would just be a standard thing to do, but for some it was not, right? And we'll see why in our studies from Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Here we go with. When Congress finally acted in June 1864 to resolve the controversy over unequal pay, the resulting legislation only partially satisfied black demands. The unequal pay was $10 per month with a $3 clothing deduction for blacks, and $13 per month with a $3.50 clothing allowance for the whites. People like Mr. Frederick Douglass campaigned on behalf of the Negro soldiers to finally get Congress to do the right thing, but that only partially satisfied black demands. Although racial distinctions in pay were abolished, the new law made a curious distinction in retroactive payments between free Negroes, those free before April 19, 1861, who would be paid from the date of their enlistment, and freedmen whose retroactive payments would begin on January 1, 1864. This posed a considerable problem in the regiments, which included both free Negroes and ex-slaves. It
divides the colored soldiers into two grades,
one abolitionist charged, and
does honor to injustice with a vengeance.
In the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, Colonel E.N. Hallowell worked out a rather ingenious solution. Since the commanders of black regiments were to determine which of their men were free Negroes, he simply had them all take an oath that on or before April 19, 1861, they
owed no man unrequited labor.
The colonel of the light complexion looked out for his men in this situation. He made it to where all Negroes in his regiment, whether they were actually free or not before that date, received the higher back pay. They just had to take an oath saying that they were free before that date, right? And more than likely, everyone took that oath. This was satisfactory for the 54th, which included very few former slaves, but such a solution was deemed unacceptable in the regiments made up almost exclusively of freed men. It worked in the 54th Regiment because most of those gentlemen had come from the North and they had never been slaves before. But this trick couldn't work in other regiments where the circumstance was reversed, and most of the men actually were former slaves. In this instance, the loophole couldn't work because it was too obvious and the local records could expose the falsehood.
If a year's discussion has at length secured the arrears of pay for the Northern Colored Regiment,
an irate Colonel Higginson remarked,
possibly 2 years may secure it for the Southern.
Meaning Congress fixed the pay issue for the Northern colored folks, but were slow to resolve it for the Southerners, which implies that there was further discrimination against the newly freedmen. Still, the action of Congress placated the Northern regiments, and the first payday, October 1864, under the new law took on a festive air.
2 days have changed the face of things,
an officer with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment observed.
The fiddle and other music long neglected enlivens the tents day and night. Songs burst out everywhere. Dancing is incessant. Boisterous shouts are heard. Mimicry, burlesque, and carnival. Pompous salutations are heard on all sides.
They were pumped to receive that pay, right? This was a victory worth celebrating for them. But perhaps, though, the real struggle had only begun. Despite the equalization of pay, black soldiers had not yet been accorded the same rights and recognition as whites. Still not quite there, right? They just didn't have it in them to make it all the way equal at that time. Here were the issues. The question of equal protection for black prisoners of war persisted, as did the absence of black representation in court-martial proceedings, the exclusion of blacks from the military academies, and the small number of black commissioned officers. In these areas, inequality was still pervasive. Both race pride and the brutal conduct of some white officers prompted increasing demands for the appointment of blacks to command black troops. White consciousness waging war on black consciousness to keep it in an inferior position. That had black troops demanding to have black officers. But even some of the firmest advocates of black recruitment found the idea of black officers difficult to accept. This existed first and foremost in the realm of ideas, And even some of those who advocated for blacks to join the military found this idea hard to accept. When they created the image in their imagination of a black officer, they found this idea in conflict with other ideas existing in their mind, violating as it did the white man's sensibilities and racial stereotypes in ways that enlisting blacks as common soldiers had not. It violated the ideas the whites held in their mind about themselves and about what a black person was. The idea was that those called whites were to be rulers over those they called blacks. That was the intention behind creating the racial worldview as part of their system of domination, right? The idea of a black officer was completely against that intention, but the regular soldier was not nearly as much. Since childhood, blacks had been trained
to obey implicitly the dictates of the white man
and to believe that they belonged to an inferior race. More than 200 years at that point of learning to accept ideas that they were black people from an inferior race who obeys the white man. This might still make them good soldiers, but hardly leaders of men. That's how it could be more easily acceptable to have blacks as troops, because the vast majority of them were led by white officers, which reinforced the same concept of master and slave, superior and inferior, white and black, right? Officer and troops. That was the symbolism, which you have to understand, because that's how they locked the consciousness down using that.
Now, when organized into troops,
A Union officer observed,
they carry this habit of obedience with them, and their officers being entirely white men, the Negro promptly obeys his orders.
which is what an enlisted person is supposed to do in relation to an officer anyways. But he's pointing out the fact that Negroes already came trained to obey the orders from whites before they entered into any military service. The impression that blacks would naturally serve white officers more loyally was difficult to dispel, and some observers seriously questioned if black troops would be willing to serve under black officers.
In the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, among the soldiers,
A regimental officer told an anti-slavery meeting was that they did not want
a colored man to play the white man over them.
I most certainly believe that at least some of them said this. But many blacks denied these inferences, and I believe that many of the blacks denied it as well, charged that the relative absence of black officers helped to perpetuate the idea of racial inferiority, and insisted that blacks be judged for promotions and commissions on the same basis as whites, not given any extra sympathy or preferential treatment because of skin color. They wanted to be judged for promotions and commissions on the same basis as the whites.
We want black commissioned officers
One soldier argued,
because we want men we can understand and who can understand us. We want to demonstrate our ability to rule, as we have demonstrated our willingness to obey.
There was a segment of blacks who thought like this. They wanted to show that they could rule as well, and in fact, they could. Now, when I was in the Marine Corps, there were plenty of leaders who identified themselves as blacks. The highest ranking officer in my battalion was of the rich brown skin complexion, Lieutenant Colonel Williamson of 9th Com Battalion, and I can tell you one thing, that he did not get that rank by being a diversity hire. He got there by demonstrating his ability to rule, and he was judged for promotion on the same basis as anyone else. Now let's move on. Shortly after the Civil War broke out, Martin R. Delaney, still reflecting the racial pride that had made him an immigrationist and black nationalist in the 1850s, contemplated
Accord d'Afrique,
modeled after the black Zouaves who had served the French in the Algerine War. Characteristically, he stressed that the origin, dress, and tactics of the Zouaves d'Afrique were uniquely African. Along similar lines, Henry M. Turner, whose racial pride matched that of Delaney, but whose advocacy of immigration still lay in the future, expressed the hope that there would be no racial intermingling in the newly organized black regiments.
if we do go in the field, let us have our own soldiers, captains, colonels, and generals, and then an entire separation from soldiers of every other color, and then bid us strike for our liberty. And if we deserve any merit, it will stand out beyond contradiction.
He wanted blacks only, so no whites could be credited if they accomplished anything noteworthy. Because even if something noteworthy was done by all the Negro soldiers, if they had a white officer commanding them, then the officer would ultimately get the credit, right? That's just how it goes. And of course he knew that, which is one of the reasons why he wanted all black soldiers and all black leadership. But Turner's proposal, like Delaney's, was premature. Having made the decision to use blacks as soldiers, the government was not prepared to flaunt numbers of black officers before an already apprehensive white public. All tying back to white consciousness, which from the perspective of the whites, they had a reason to feel a certain way about it because it was really breaking down their identity. And nearly no one likes their identity stripped away. No sooner had Congress equalized the pay of white and black soldiers than various schemes for a black army were revived, the most ambitious plan remaining Martin Delaney's Corps d'Afrique. Observe. This time he took his idea directly to President Lincoln. Good old President Lincoln, the abolitionist. What he proposed was a black army commanded by black officers that would operate essentially as a guerrilla-type force in the interior, emancipating and arming the slaves wherever they went.
They would require but little,
Delaney assured the president,
as they could subsist on the country as they went along.
President Lincoln, as Delaney described his reaction, could barely contain his enthusiasm.
"This is the very thing I have been looking and hoping for,"
he told Delaney.
But nobody offered it.
The president was with it, and this happened. Having agreed to command and raise such an army, Delaney was commissioned a major and ordered to South Carolina. Someone of the brown complexion as an officer. The times changeth right before the eyes of the people. Now what happened to Major Delaney and his black army? The war ended before he could put his plan into operation, but Delaney remained in South Carolina and subsequently embraced and acted upon still another vision: political power in a state where blacks comprised a majority of the population. It fell through, but it was still a step in the right direction. And with that being said, we continue with to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.